Fillian Hunt, the locksmith, sat at his workbench trying to develop new mechanisms. While his long, elegant dark hair and neatly trimmed beard might give off the impression of a glamour boy, his hands showed the opposite. Rugged, veiny, with cuts and bruises that were too many to count. Hard-working hands that made an honest living in the village, struggling and poor. While he never earned much, his positive attitude towards life was certainly contagious. With his white long-sleeve baggy cotton shirt rolled up to his forearms and a dirty leather apron strapped onto him, he watched the wooden door of his workshop slowly opening. Old man Fenwick walked in with a look of worry on his face. "Oh, forgive me, Fillian the locksmith," he said. "How wrong and foolish was I to visit the other locksmiths instead of you. They scammed me, I say. They scammed an old man in need. The locking mechanism and the key they have bestowed upon me was merely a fake. My doors open and close themselves with a mere gush of wind. How can I sleep at night knowing my wife and daughter have no security? Will you graciously forgive and help me, Fillian?" The locksmith smiled warmly at Mr. Fenwick, making jokes to turn the frown into a chuckle. Old man Fenwick truly was troubled, especially with the marriage of his daughter Anne-Marie just around the corner. At dusk, despite the workshop being closed to customers, Fillian Hunt took 15 minutes to make the best locking mechanism in all the land. Then he carved a key with crude metal and gifted the old man. Fillian saw Mr. Fenwick counting pennies and doing the math in his head. His old, trembling, wrinkled hand held on tight to his last penny with the look of defeat on his face, then gently offered it to the locksmith. However, Fillian Hunt refused to take the coin. He said, "Oh no, Mr. Fenwick, I shan't take any coin from you. Keep it for Anne-Marie's dowry. Just make sure that the marriage goes well and have the biggest mug of wine for me. You work too hard, Mr. Fenwick, you deserve it. Oh, and here's a bag of bread from me, my gift to the family." This was true. Fillian Hunt was an awful businessman but a kind-hearted soul. There was no other. Mr. Fenwick sobbed in his hands, trying to hide the embarrassment. He wiped his nose and tears and thanked the locksmith 5 times before walking out. Times were tough indeed. Mr. Hunt put a blanket down on the wooden floor of his workstation, then tossed a big fluffy pillow next to it. The locksmith slept on his makeshift bed, thankful for everything that he had. Despite him struggling, he had bread on his table and a roof over his head, something that very few could say in the village. The quietness of the night and the cool breeze helped people sleep easier than usual. However, that was soon about to change. The locksmith jumped up from his sleeping position, startled as ever. Outside his home, the village folk frantically ran and screamed for their lives, taking shelter while pointing at the sky. "He's here," they exclaimed repeatedly, pointing at the flying creature circling the village. Fillian Hunt stormed out of his home and looked up at the night sky. Then he saw it. A terrifying vampire monster with large wings and glowing red eyes. Its teeth were not long but multiplied and razor sharp. The interior of the wings resembled that of a bat, but it was stained with a dark crimson color. The body was peculiar, muscular and furry, with 2 horns pushing out on either side of its head. The monster was so large that every time it flapped its wings, a gush of wind blew and knocked people over. But when the creature landed, its appearance changed drastically. A tall man with long gray hair matching his coat was now standing in the village. The red eyes remained the same, so did the sharp fingernails and teeth, but his mannerisms were calm and collected. There was something about the way he walked, strides slow and steady, filled with arrogance, malice and terror. This would be Vlad Tepes, aka Dracula. Fillian trembled in his boots. The village folk continued running in fear, stumbling and knocking over obstacles in their path. This was only a brief moment. The locksmith locked eyes with the vampire in front, but it felt like an eternity. As scared as Fillian was, he turned back and ran, not to retreat but to get as many people out of the village. Children, women, and the elderly man came first, then the rest. Mr. Fenwick grabbed his chest, getting chest pains with the chaos around him. When he and his wife were taken to safety, he begged Fillian to try and find Anne-Marie. The locksmith continued rescuing people at a much slower pace since fatigue was now settling in. But with each person he saved, he heard 5 more being slaughtered. Dracula moved at the speed of light, but it never looked like he ran or walked, rather dashed forward in the blink of an eye. This was a village massacre. Fillian Hunt felt the hopelessness slowly consuming his body. When he ran back to the village to get more people out, he saw Anne-Marie. "Marie!" he exclaimed in horror. A young woman with long dark brown hair, almost the same age as Fillian, was now in the grasp of Dracula. He held her tightly against his body as she struggled, and then pushed her head to the side and sunk his fangs into her neck. Fillian yelled at the higher vampire running towards him, his eyes filled with tears, unable to hide the fear which made his body tremble. But Fillian was too late. Anne-Marie's eyes closed slowly. Then Dracula tossed her to the ground. In his calm, collected, monotone, whispering voice, he said, "You there, young man. I will give you 2 choices. You can continue saving people as I destroy this village, or you can face me one-on-one. Buy these folks some time to escape, and who knows, maybe you will defeat me. Maybe you will die. Or maybe I will turn you." Now, as Fillian the vampire cop made haste from the village of the Harrow, he reached the Redwater Police Station. He heard gunfire from the precinct and saw the red smoke from the flares surrounding the entire building. Inspectors yelling out commands, shouting out positions, and others screaming in horror. But next to the building stood Dracula. No matter how dark the night was, his pale skin and red eyes could easily be spotted. His long grey coat matched his long dark grey hair blowing in the wind, while he nibbled on his razor-sharp fingernails. This menacing, troublesome, extremely powerful vampire oozed confidence. The evil smirk on his pale face spoke more words than he ever could. Fillian Hunt's eyes were smoldering red as he clenched his jaw and fist, ready to charge at Dracula. The higher vampire, however, held out a finger in front. "Easy there, Inspector. I'm going to give you 2 choices. You could either face me and maybe defeat me, since you are now a vampire. And by doing so, you could rid this world of me and all the horrors that I will most certainly commit. Or you could enter your beloved Redwater Police Station and save your precious loyal servants of the law from the monster that I have set loose on them. What will it be? You can take your chances with your creator, or save those people, revealing your secret and showing them all you are a vampire. Decide quickly, boy. The monster in there is really hungry." Fillian's entire body shook with rage as he ground his teeth. The same dilemma Dracula gave him almost a century ago. The vampire reluctantly looked away from Dracula and ran towards the entrance of the police station. And just before Dracula could vanish into a wisp of smoke, he laughed in an evil, conceited manner, then said, "So the games begin." The vampire cop entered the police station and saw bullets flying across the room and smoke grenades detonating. The inspectors weren't really aiming. They took cover and shot blindly. But when Fillian ran forward, the chaos ceased. The monster in the precinct stopped the onslaught. A woman with an ugly, petrifying face was levitating in the air just before she calmly landed. She stood on one of the wooden tables, swaying and dancing to music that wasn't playing. Her long, sharp teeth slowly changed back into its normal state. The woman then held a hand to her face and licked the back of her palm, the same way that a cat would lick its paw, as she took in all the blood blotches. Her long dark brown hair swayed with her as her hips moved side to side seductively. The woman then turned in a swirl motion and finally faced the entrance. "Fillian," she said in a cheeky tone, laughing like a maniac, "it's been too long." As the vampire cop looked around the room and saw the bodies of a few inspectors lying on the floor, the wounded quietly crawling away to the medical bay, and the remainder reloading their weapons for a second attack, he realized Dracula wasn't lying about a monster being in the precinct. But Fillian never thought this monster hopping on the table laughing sadistically would be Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie looked around the chaos that she created. "Oopsie doopsie," she said, "looks like I've made a mess." Fillian Hunt stood in bewilderment. How on earth was any of this possible, he thought. The woman then bolted across the room, jumped out the window, and flew away. The Redwater police force that had their weapons aiming at her slowly changed their direction from the window towards Fillian. One by one, they began shouting at him. How did this monster know who you were? And why didn't she attack you? The vampire cop backed up as he felt the anxiety building up in his chest. What was he supposed to say? That he knew Anne-Marie 100 years ago before any of them were even born? Was he supposed to tell them right then and there that he's been lying to them this entire time? Captain Mills walked in front of Fillian as his eyes widened. She faced her back towards him, willing to take the line of fire head on, just to save him. Mills painfully held her neck where Anne-Marie had made a gash and said,
"Is this what has become of the RPF? The moment Captain Langley dies and you all begin turning on each other? Fillian Hunt has been working this serial killer case since 2 days ago. She's sending him and all of us a message to leave her alone. Can you all not see that? Oh, and a monster? Don't you know she specializes in hallucinogens? We only saw what she wanted us to see. That is her trick. Frightens her victims and then snatch them away. We've dealt with bizarre serial killers before."
The inspectors put their weapons down only to find guilt covering their faces. "We're sorry, Fillian," they said. "It was the heat of the moment. Adrenaline pumping. So far you haven't led us astray. We were wrong for pointing our weapons at you." Of course, they never knew Captain Mills was lying to them. Fillian Hunt never knew Anne-Marie was alive until 5 minutes ago. While everyone in the precinct tended to their wounds and carried the unconscious towards the ambulance, Captain Mills gave a side eye to the vampire cop, calling him into her office immediately.
"Where on God's green earth were you, Fillian? I sent you on the Crimson Lichen case 2 days ago, and you went MIA.
Forgive me, Captain, I was caught up in something. Still am, actually, but
nothing. I cannot keep covering for you, Inspector. Now, I can't lie anymore. You have to take on this case whether you like it or not. And whatever people ask you, do not answer. My orders. I had to lie about the hallucinogen part. Our inspectors are not used to seeing vampire creatures. But more importantly, how did she know your name?"
Many people know of me, Captain. But what I want to know is, why did you refer to her as the woman in black? When was she reported to be a serial killer?
About 70 years ago.
What?
Yeah, the case of the woman in black turned cold a long time ago. Have a seat, Fillian. I'll go through it with you.
The vampire cop sat at Captain Mills' desk, reading pages from multiple books at a time, while Mills ran down the details. The Redwater Police Station had no digital database, which meant that everything was recorded in books and booklets of parchment paper tied with string.
The first report was 70 years ago. A group of friends were roaming around in an abandoned building when they heard screams echoing through, screams of torture. Foolishly, they chose to investigate themselves. Out of the 5 friends, only one survived. He said it was a mini dungeon in an abandoned building with people tied up with ropes and chains being drained of their blood. The blood was filling up into vials kept on a wooden table. But here's the scary part. The witness said the victims in the dungeon weren't all human. Some were men covered in thick fur, presumed to be werewolves, while others were vampires. However, there were more humans than the previously mentioned. He described the serial killer as the woman in black. She had long, dark brown hair, glowing red eyes, sharp teeth, claws, and wings pushing out from her back. Her black dress stained with blood from the many victims she tortured and killed, 67 to be exact.
How did the guy survive?
No idea. The report doesn't say.
Where was the abandoned building located?
It was near Cascada before the large city was revamped into a gold mine. but the inspector's report that handled the case mentioned the mini dungeon was empty when they got there. No vampires, no werewolves, and none of the reported missing folk hanging from chains. The building was destroyed over time, and the case went cold. None of the missing people were found.
Okay, since then, how many other reports have there been?
Quite a few, actually, but no one knows if it was really her or a copycat.
So did all the reports come from Cascada?
Nope, here in Redwater, actually. Some said they saw a woman wearing a black dress dragging victims into the woods. When people followed, neither she nor the victims were seen. It's like they vanished into thin air. Others saw the woman in black levitating in the air, just like what we saw 10 minutes ago. I thought it was some ghost story or spooky tale, but when she showed up in our precinct, that was enough confirmation for me.
This is just not possible. None of this is possible.
Wait, why? What do you mean?
The woman that you speak of, the one that you all know as the woman in black, I know as Anne-Marie. She was the daughter of an elderly man named Mr. Fenwick. They lived in the same village that I did.
So you do know her, but why do you keep referring to her in the past tense?
Well, that's because Anne-Marie died almost 100 years ago. You see, Captain, that night in the village when some of us were bitten to be killed and others to be turned by Dracula, Anne-Marie was one of the victims belonging to the former. I don't know how long I passed out for that night, but when I did wake up, I saw my village being destroyed. People that I once knew were now ruthless vampires, feeding on the remaining village folk. Anne-Marie was still lying on the ground, and next to her was Mr. Fenwick and his wife. I fought my way out of the village, carrying all three of them with me. They were good people, Captain. Mr. Fenwick put bread on my table when I was a novice locksmith. I had to give them a proper burial. Anne-Marie was bitten before me. If she was turned that night, she would have waken up before I did. Captain Mills was lost for words. This was the first time she saw sadness on Fillian's face. With how the vampire cop carries out himself, no one would ever think that he went through something that tragic. She said,
"But if Anne-Marie died all those years ago and you buried her, how did she become a vampire monster?"
Yep, that's what I would like to know. It's not unheard of for people to be turned into vampires after they have died, but no one knew where I buried Anne-Marie. Unless she crawled out of her grave during me dealing with a ghost, or an imposter just to mess with my mind. Either way, Captain, I must take your leave. My investigation begins immediately.
But Fillian, how are you gonna go? The sun will be up in a few hours.
I have no choice, Captain. Unfortunately, I do not have the luxury of time on my hands. I'm going to have to find a way to walk in the sun and solve this case before the upcoming nightfall. However, you needn't worry. You have all these inspectors to tend to in Captain Langley's investigation. You have my undying thanks, Captain Mills, and forgive me for my absence. I give you my word that I will never let you down again. As Fillian Hunt got out of his chair, taking the books and the parchment paper of the reports, Captain Mills reminded him where the recent sightings of the woman in black were, just on the outskirts of Redwater. The vampire cop thanked Captain Mills and then walked out, hiding the troublesome thoughts swimming in his mind. The outskirts of Redwater near the woods was exactly where Fillian buried her. Fillian Hunt ran home as quickly as possible before sunrise. He could have changed into a monster yet again, but recently using that power against Ragnar and then on the Hellhound sure did take its toll. He made his way down to his wooden basement filled with an arsenal of weapons and books dating back right from the previous month all the way to the time before he was even born. Books that contained vital information about monsters that made his job much easier. Fillian placed the books he had taken from Captain Mills onto a wooden table. With candles beside him, he spent the early hours of the morning reading the reports of the woman in black and saw the sketches of the missing people in the past 70 years. But he couldn't believe what he was reading. Some of the missing folk were the same people that he rescued from the village that night. 2 hours and 16 minutes later, the sun rose. As Fillian told Captain Mills, time was of the essence. The Jungle of Bellevue was one of the stories that he read from his library in the basement. Since the vampire cop was the fastest among all the heroes thus far, he needed to be present for the jungle mission. He then opened a cupboard in the basement and pulled out an old, dusty, hooded brown cloak. This piece of clothing was a much bigger size than Fillian normally wore, but for good reason. This old brown cloak blocked out every bit of sunlight. Still very risky, but he had no other choice. Similar to how we would grab a coffee or tea to go, Fillian Hunt had grabbed a cup of blood, then made haste to the woods of Redwater. First things first, he needed to investigate Anne-Marie's gravesite. Folk passing by never saw the pale vampire disguised in his cloak. They just saw him as a beggar roaming around aimlessly. This would be the first time since that night that he would see the graves of the Fenwicks, not because he had forgotten about them, because it was just too painful returning. Anne-Marie's grave was indeed dug out. The soil was dry with roots and weeds that were sticking out. Captain Mills was right. She had been out for a really long time. First tick off the checklist. This was no ghost that they were dealing with. This was certainly Anne-Marie. As Fillian walked into the woods of Redwater, the largest woodland area in all the land, he remembered the reports. Humans, vampires, and werewolves were being held captive, being drained of their blood and then kept in vials by the woman in black. He also remembered the description of the werewolves as hairy, furry men, which indicated they were natural-born werewolves. Fillian felt a sense of unease looming in his mind. Mixing the blood of normal humans with werewolves and vampires was a recipe for disaster. Literally. The trees in the woods of Redwater had their own unique power. If one would listen closely, the trees would play back the sound of those who were tortured in the woods, like an invisible tape recorder. Fillian Hunt closed his eyes and listened attentively. Fillian played back the reports in his head about the woman in black walking into the woods late at night, then mysteriously vanishing. However, he knew that she couldn't change into a wisp of smoke, not like himself and Dracula. If Anne-Marie could, she would have done so in the precinct. Fillian heard the screams of those being dragged in the woods all those years ago. The trees played back sounds of footsteps on wood, then a latch opening and closing. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the ground, realizing Anne-Marie never vanished into thin air, rather moved underground. It took the vampire cop almost 3 hours moving as quickly as he possibly could, but eventually he found it. There were leaves blended in quite well, hiding the wooden latch door in the woods. Anne-Marie covered her tracks to the extent of painting the door with the same color and texture of the soil on the ground. Fillian held out his finger and his nail grew 5 inches, sharp and pointy. He used it as a lockpick to open the latch on the wooden door, lifted it open while looking around, then carefully made his way underground. When the vampire cop walked down the stairs, he felt like the path was leading him into the abyss. The staircase just continued and continued in absolute darkness. Halfway down, he turned back, contemplating whether this was a huge mistake. However, as he continued, he saw a dim light at the bottom from lanterns. Finally, some progress. But when Fillian reached the bottom of the staircase entering the dark and cold dungeon, he was attacked. What on earth was this creature? Was this a werewolf? The furry body and pointy snout had indicated as such, but why did this creature have yellow human eyes? Why were the 2 fangs on the upper row of teeth so distinctive? Why were its ears so pointy and peculiar? This malevolent beast merely nudged Fillian and pushed him back almost a meter. The vampire cop fell to the ground, but swiftly pulled out his pistol concealed in his old brown cloak. If this monster really was a werewolf, silver bullets would either slow it down or end it entirely. Hence, Fillian fired a few shots. What the? Fillian was stunned. Werewolves were fast, but not that fast. It moved the way a vampire would. The monster crawled towards the vampire, hissing and grunting, taking swipes as Fillian backed up each time. Alas, the monster's razor claws caught into the vampire's cloak and ripped it to shreds. While Fillian could now move freely, the look of panic on his face could not be contained. Not even the Crimson Lichen was this quick. Not even Ragnar was this quick. A fearsome battle took place with this unknown creature and the vampire cop. Fillian Hunt punched, kicked, elbowed and kneed at every possible weak point that he could think of, but it did nothing. As the fight went on, there was a feeling of defeat looming in the air for him. He was indeed still faster than this beast, but how could he defeat something that never felt pain? Something that never felt pain. Fillian's eyes widened. If this creature couldn't feel pain, that meant the thalamus and the cortex in the monster's brain was either damaged or manipulated. The vampire cop moved around the beast as smooth as water, maneuvering between rocks. He swung his hand out as if this move was a switch of some sort. His fingernails grew 5 inches, becoming razor-edged knives, and then used it in 3 distinctive spots. First spot was in the side of the monster, just above the hip. Second was inside the armpit. And third was the most important, directly into the brain. The monster's glowing yellow eyes dimmed and turned off like a worn-out light bulb. However, the creature's brain burst like a pumpkin falling to the ground and soaked the vampire cop's long black coat with crimson blood. Just when Fillian thought he could take a moment to reset, calm his nerves, 5 more of these creatures bolted out from one of the dungeon rooms, viciously lunging at the vampire cop. While they had similarities to the first beast in terms of movement and their human eyes, they did look different. Some were smaller, leaner, leaning towards the vampire side, whereas the rest were larger, muscular, leaning towards the werewolf side. Hybrids. The vampire cop never wasted any more ammunition. He never used the wooden stake in his long black coat to pierce their heart, since neither options worked. Instead, he slew them down just like the first monster, swiftly but with incredible power and speed. Once they were down, he inspected the dungeon using his lightning-quick speed and found no other hybrid creatures, just vials and vials of blood and operating tables. However, when he made his way back, the relief on Fillian's face turned into absolute horror. The hybrids on the ground gradually decreased in size, losing their fur and pointy ears, losing their sharp teeth, pale skin and muscular, terrifying bodies, and turned into normal humans. But these were not just any ordinary humans. These were the missing people from the reports more than 70 years ago. What cruel game of misfortune had been cast upon Fillian Hunt? Some of the very folk he rescued from the village that night were now lying at his feet, slain by his hand. Fillian fell to his knees and felt sick to his stomach. He pulled and messed up his neatly slicked back hair in despair. Young men and women were lying at his feet. A few elderly folk that he remembered from back then were now deceased because of him. Despite them being no more the people that he once knew, despite them being vicious, hybrid monsters that were going to rip him to shreds, Fillian Hunt could only see them as the victims that he once saved. How was this even possible? What on earth was going on here? The vampire cop repeatedly checked on them, waking them up, gently tapping their faces as his voice was shaky, filled with worry and panic. "What have I done?" he repeatedly said. He knew they wouldn't wake up, yet his heart tried nevertheless. Absolutely distraught and numb from everything that just happened, his hands trembled uncontrollably, removing a phone the size of a brick from his coat. It took him a while to dial the correct number, but then Captain Mills picked up. His message was short, cold, and to the point. He told Captain Mills not to pursue this case any further. He told her how he found the dungeon of Anne-Marie and how she's been experimenting on the missing people, turning them into werewolf-vampire hybrids. For the safety of the entire police force, he urged her not to send any inspectors into the woods of Redwater. Captain Mills repeatedly asked him if he was okay, but he ignored the question. The signal was poor, therefore Fillian cut the call. But now he felt the entire dungeon shaking. Was this an earthquake, a tremor perhaps? A disaster causing the dungeon to cave in? As Fillian ran up the flight of stairs back into the woods, he felt the entire ground tremble as the leaves on the trees fell to the ground with each bang. But this wasn't a tremor or an earthquake. The rhythmic vibration in succession increased in tempo and amplitude. When he climbed out, he never realized how long he spent in the dungeon, since it was already dark. He heard werewolves howling in the distance. He heard the sound of magical explosions and growls. Fillian Hunt slammed the dungeon door in anger and left it the way he found it. No, this was no tremor. This was the sound of the drums and the marching of the monster barbarians in the distance. With a heavy heart, a troubled mind, and a soul filled with turmoil, the vampire cop ran as fast as he possibly could, making his way to the jungle of Belru.